I stood in the lawyer's office frozen as the words left his mouth, my heart hammering so hard that I could barely hear over the pounding in my ears. Your mother withdrew the inheritance funds 6 months ago. Everything is gone. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal, like some kind of bad sitcom where the punchline is always at my expense. What do you mean gone? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, the lawyer shifting uncomfortably in his chair as if bracing for impact. The account was liquidated, all assets transferred to her personal account, and according to the paperwork you signed, he paused. Flipping a page, it was under her management until you reached 30, which technically gave her legal rights. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. 30. That number hit like a sledgehammer because I had been counting the days until that milestone, the day I thought my father's promise would finally be fulfilled, the day I would finally hold the money he had saved for me, money that was supposed to change my life. My father worked his entire life for that inheritance. He told me again and again that it was my safety net, my chance at freedom, and he made me swear never to let anyone take advantage of it. And now here I was, 30 years old, sitting in a stuffy office, hearing that my mother, the woman who used to tuck me in at night, had stolen it all. I asked the only question that made sense in that moment. What did she spend it on? The lawyer sighed, sliding a folder toward me. Your sister's house, her student loans, her new car, and several personal expenditures. My mouth went dry. My hands shook as I opened the folder and saw receipts, checks with my mother's looping handwriting, thousands upon thousands funneled straight into my sister's life while I had been scraping by paycheck to paycheck. I felt my cheeks burning, not just from anger but humiliation, because suddenly every snide look, every dismissive comment, every time my mom told me I should understand why my sister needed more, all of it clicked into place. This wasn't favoritism anymore. This was theft. She stole my future, I whispered, and the lawyer gave me a look of pity, one I didn't want, one I refused to accept. Because in that moment, in that suffocating office filled with leather and dust, I made a silent vow. If my mother thought she could rob me and walk away unscathed, she was dead wrong. I drove home that night gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, replaying every memory of my mother choosing my sister over me, every single moment when she reminded me that I wasn't the priority. Suddenly it all made sense. It wasn't just emotional favoritism, it was financial too. She had been planning this for years. I pulled into my small apartment complex, the kind with peeling paint on the stair railings and neighbors who blasted music at midnight, and I sat there in my car staring at the cracked windshield I still hadn't been able to afford to fix. Meanwhile, my sister was living in a 3-bedroom house my father's money had bought her, driving a shiny new SUV, posting Instagram stories about brunches and vacations. Rage filled me like wildfire, but beneath it was something colder, sharper, more dangerous. Revenge. I wasn't going to scream at my mother, I wasn't going to beg for scraps, I wasn't even going to ask her why, because I already knew the answer. She always thought my sister deserved more, and now she had proof of it written in numbers. Instead, I started planning. I opened my laptop, searched through my father's old emails he had forwarded me before he died, the ones where he had told me to always keep your eyes open. He had been meticulous, he left breadcrumbs, and as I followed them I discovered things my mother didn't know I had: copies of the will, old property deeds, even insurance policies. She thought she had taken everything, but she hadn't, not entirely. And if there was one thing my father taught me, it was that the law only protects those who know how to use it. I spent that entire night digging, making lists, connecting dots, until the sun rose and my eyes burned from staring at the screen. By the time I dragged myself to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, I didn't see the broke, forgotten child anymore. I saw someone dangerous, someone patient. Someone who was going to take back every penny and make sure my mother regretted ever thinking I was weak. The first thing I did was call the lawyer back and tell him I needed every document copied and certified. Not tomorrow, not next week now, because if my mother sensed I knew, she would start covering tracks. And I wasn't going to let her bury what she'd done under years of family loyalty and crocodile tears. He hesitated, mumbling about office policy, about how this wasn't a criminal complaint yet, about how emotions run high in probate matters, and I cut him off with a steady, even voice that surprised even me. "I'm not asking for your sympathy. I'm asking for my paperwork." 30 minutes later, I was back in his reception area, pen in hand, signing the request forms, keeping my face expressionless while my stomach churned like a storm, when the paralegal slid the binder to me. I could have sworn I felt my father's hand on my shoulder telling me to keep moving. I took the binder to a coffee shop across the street and opened it to the first page, the trust language. The clause that had always sounded like a loving parental safeguard and now read like a trapdoor. Trustee shall have discretion to manage, invest, and distribute on behalf of the beneficiary until the age of 30. And there it was, the gap my mother had crawled through with a smile, the gap my father had probably assumed she'd never abuse because he couldn't imagine the woman he loved weaponizing caretaking against their own daughter. I flipped the pages and highlighted the transfer dates, noted the amounts, annotated every line item that smelled like a favor to my sister, and then I found something that stopped me cold. 3 signatures that weren't mine. Copies of consents supposedly signed by me when I was 27, 28, and 29, green ink, loopy, careful, familiar, but not mine. My chest tightened, because forgery wasn't favoritism anymore. Forgery was a crime. And suddenly the plan in my head sharpened from revenge into restoration, from anger into strategy. I took photos of those pages and emailed them to a forensic document examiner I found through a bar association referral list, leaving a short message with my number and the subject line, "Potential trust fraud, urgent." And then I called a different lawyer. A woman in her 50s with a reputation for making wealthy bullies cry in depositions, and I booked a consultation for the following afternoon, because if my mother wanted to play with legal language, then I would bring someone who spoke it better and louder and with teeth. On the way home, I drove past my sister's new house purely to feel how the anger sat in me. A tidy craftsman with a perfect lawn and a brass mailbox that still had the tag from the hardware store hanging off it, and when she pulled up, late afternoon sunlight bouncing off her sunglasses, she didn't see me parked under the elm across the street, but I saw her, and I saw the new stroller in the back of the SUV, and I felt a complicated stab of guilt. Because none of this was the baby's fault, and none of this changed the bone-deep fact that I had been robbed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. I went home and opened the old accordion file my father left me, the one my mother had always told me to throw away because it was morbid, and inside were the breadcrumbs I had started following the night before. Photocopies of a small lakeside parcel he bought in cash when I was a kid, a note that said, "In case of emergencies," not to be listed with the main trust, and I could hear his voice again, careful, cautious, loving in the way men like him are. Not with flowers and speeches, but with plans and backups and quietly labeled folders. I typed the parcel number into the county recorder's site and almost cried when I saw it sitting there untouched, modestly valued, but free and clear, because it meant I had leverage. It meant there was something my mother hadn't swallowed whole. And leverage is oxygen when you're drowning. I was still staring at the screen when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother, short and sharp like a tap on a glass. "Dinner Sunday. Your sister wants to share news. Please be supportive." And I stared at the words for a long time, counting to 5, then 10, then 20, before I typed back a single word, "busy," and put the phone face down like it could bite. A minute later it buzzed again, "You're being selfish," and I didn't answer, because the old me would have explained, would have apologized, would have shown up with pie and swallowed whatever hurt they served. But the new me was building a wall of facts and signatures and chain of custody emails, and the only thing I had room for was the next step. The forensic examiner called back at 9:40, her voice calm and precise as she explained the process, that she'd need original documents if possible. That high-resolution scans might still reveal stroke overlap and pen pressure if the originals were temporarily unavailable, that in the best-case scenario we could determine whether the signatures were simulated or traced. I scheduled a courier for the morning, thanked her, and then I called the tough lawyer, and when she picked up, I told her everything in a flat, steady line like I was reading it from a teleprompter, because if I let my voice shake, I'd fall apart, and falling apart wasn't on the agenda. She listened without interrupting and then asked me two questions that sliced right to the bone. Do you want your money back, or do you want blood? And after a beat, are you prepared for what it means when we choose both? And I closed my eyes and saw my mother's hand guiding my sister's pen over a mortgage application while telling me I should be happy for family success. And I said, with a clarity that startled me, I want what my father intended for me, and I want her to never do this again to anyone. And the lawyer said, then we start with a demand letter, followed by a petition to compel an accounting, and if she refuses, we move to discovery and fraud allegations. If those signatures are forged, we bring in the DA. And something in me exhaled for the first time in months. I barely slept, not from fear anymore, but from the hum of a machine finally powering on, and at dawn I went for a run for the first time in a year, feet slapping the pavement, lungs burning, the world cold and bright. And when I got back, there were two emails waiting, one from the examiner confirming receipt of the scans and noting preliminary anomalies, and one from the lawyer with a draft attached, demand for immediate return and accounting, and I read it 3 times, savoring every clinical sentence, every date, every statute cited, because the words were a lifeline and a warning all at once. I forwarded the draft to my own email, printed a hard copy, slid it into a plain folder, and drove to my mother's house, not to ring the bell, not to argue in the doorway like we always did, but to slip it into her mailbox at precisely 10 a.m. when I knew she'd just returned from her water aerobics class, hair tucked under a floral swim cap, mind clear, least likely to claim she never got it, and as I turned to leave I heard the latch click. Her voice floating out, syrupy and sharp. I thought I saw your car, darling. Are you finally here to help with your sister's baby shower? And I turned back and met her eyes, and for the first time in my life I didn't flinch. No, I said, calm as glass, I'm here to return what you took, and I watched the confusion flash to irritation and then to the brittle brightness she always wore when company was coming, and she smiled like this was a game, like we were trading barbs before brunch. And she said, sweetheart, I have no idea what you're talking about, and I just nodded at the mailbox. You will, I said, stepping off the porch by noon, and I walked to my car without looking back, hands steady on the steering wheel, phone already in my lap. Stopwatch started, because the demand letter gave her 48 hours to respond before we filed. But I knew my mother, and I knew I'd hear from her in less than 2. It didn't even take 2 hours, it took 43 minutes, my phone lighting up with her name while I was still sitting in the parking lot of the grocery store pretending to shop, because I wanted to be close enough to watch the storm gather. I let it ring out the first time, then the second, then on the third I answered, keeping my voice neutral, almost bored. What is this nonsense? She hissed, no hello, no motherly softness, just venom dripping through the receiver. You think you can threaten me with lawyers? After everything I've done for you? After raising you on my own when your father died? My grip tightened on the phone, but I forced myself to breathe, because rage wouldn't serve me now, calm would. You didn't raise me, I said flatly. You raised Rachel. I raised myself. Silence stretched on the line, sharp and cold. Then she laughed, that brittle high laugh she used when she was cornered. You always were dramatic, Sarah, always the victim. This letter, this ridiculous piece of paper, it means nothing. That money was for family, for Rachel, for her future. Don't you dare act like your father wanted you to hoard it. Her words hit me like stones, but instead of bruising, they fueled me. That money was mine. Dad made it clear, and you forged my signature, which is fraud, not favoritism. You know what happens when fraud is proven? You don't just lose the money, you could lose everything. Another long silence, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, measured, almost trembling. You wouldn't destroy your own mother. I closed my eyes and saw my father's face the last time I visited him in the hospital, his voice thin but steady as he made me promise to stand up for myself when she tried to diminish me. "Watch me," I whispered, and I hung up before she could reply. By the time I got back to my apartment, there were 15 missed calls, 6 voicemails, and 1 long text from Rachel, filled with the usual self-pity. "I didn't ask for any of this. Mom said you're making everything complicated. Can't you just let it go? You don't even need the money, you're fine, and I have a baby now." My throat burned as I read it, not because I believed a word of it, but because she was parroting exactly what Mom had probably drilled into her since morning. I typed back one sentence: "You're living in a house spot with my future, so don't text me again," and then I blocked her number. The next day, my lawyer called to confirm she'd received an email from my mother's representative, a smug man named Douglas, who described himself as a family friend, but was really just the kind of bottom feeder who preyed on desperation. His email was filled with empty threats, claiming that pursuing this matter would irreparably damage family ties and publicly humiliate everyone involved. My lawyer chuckled as she read it aloud, her voice steady. "Classic intimidation tactic. Will respond with a notice of intent to depose." That usually makes the cockroaches scatter. For the first time in weeks, I laughed, not bitterly but freely, because I realized I wasn't fighting alone anymore. 2 days later, the forensic examiner called with her preliminary findings. "The signatures are consistent with simulation, not genuine," she explained carefully. "Meaning?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "Meaning they're forged. Whoever wrote these tried to imitate your handwriting, but the line quality, pen lifts, and pressure points don't match. In court, this would be compelling evidence of fraud." I thanked her, hung up, and sat down on the floor of my apartment, shaking with adrenaline. Fraud. The word echoed in my head like a church bell. My mother hadn't just stolen, she had broken the law, and now I had the proof. When I forwarded the report to my lawyer, she called back immediately. "We file Monday," she said, "petition to compel accounting, fraud, conversion, and breach of fiduciary duty. If she doesn't settle, we drag her into discovery and make her squirm." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, tears pricking my eyes, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of finally being seen, of finally having someone on my side. That weekend, I didn't hide, I didn't avoid family texts, I didn't cower. I went to a coffee shop near my mother's church and sat by the window reading case law, daring her to see me. And when she walked by, dressed in her Sunday best with Rachel pushing the stroller behind her, she caught sight of me. Her smile faltered, just for a second, just long enough for me to see the crack in her armor. She knew. She was afraid. And for the first time in my life, the power wasn't hers. It was mine. The courthouse smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of sterile scent that tries to convince you that justice is tidy, but justice is never tidy. Justice is a knife that cuts through pretense, and that morning I was ready to watch it bleed. I wore a simple navy dress and a pair of flats that wouldn't click too loudly on marble, hair pinned back, folders aligned in my bag, the forensic report printed 3 times and tabbed in neon. My lawyer, Ms. Patel, met me at the security line with a nod that felt like armor, precise suit, steady eyes, her tote bag heavy with case law and quiet confidence. "Breathe," she said, not like a platitude but like a command, and I obeyed, inhaling until the burn in my chest loosened. We checked in with the clerk, confirmed our petition numbers, and waited on a wooden bench that had seen more family wars than any holiday table ever would. My mother arrived 10 minutes late in a pastel suit meant to signal innocence, pearls at her throat, the same pearls she wore to every PTA meeting where she bragged about my sister, and beside her drifted Douglas, the family friend, tan, smirking, cufflinks winking like small lies. Rachel hovered behind them, eyes ringed with the sleeplessness of new motherhood or guilt or both, clutching a diaper bag like a shield, and when she caught my eye she looked away as if sunlight hurt. My mother didn't look away. She tilted her head, smiled coolly, and mouthed the word dramatic, and if I'd been the girl I used to be, I would have flushed and lowered my eyes. But the woman I'd become simply stared back and mouthed, fraud. The bailiff called our case with the dry cadence of someone who'd said too many names in the matter of the trust of the estate of David Collins, petition to compel accounting, allegations of fraud and conversion, and we rose, Ms. Patel crisp and lethal. Me quiet and solid. My mother gliding like this was a charity luncheon. The judge was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for hating nonsense, glasses low on her nose, gavel mostly unused because her eyebrows did the work. She scanned the docket, looked up, and fixed us with a gaze that made even the bailiff stand taller. "Good morning," she said. "We'll keep this straightforward. Petitioner is seeking an accounting and alleges fraudulent signatures on consent documents. Respondent is the former trustee, correct?" And Ms. Patel replied, "Yes, Your Honor," while Douglas clicked his pen like a nervous metronome. The judge frowned at the sound, waited, and when he stopped, she gestured to Ms. Patel. "Proceed." Ms. Patel didn't start with rhetoric. She started with dates, numbers, and a timeline that marched like soldiers. "Your Honor, the trust instrument granted the respondent, the mother, limited discretion to manage assets until the beneficiary, my client, turned 30. In the 3 years leading up to that milestone, the respondent liquidated the trust and transferred funds to personal and third-party accounts, including purchasing a home and luxury vehicle for the respondent's other daughter, who is not a beneficiary. The respondent claims the beneficiary consented via annual written approvals. We will show those signatures are forgeries." She slid a binder to the clerk who handed it up, and the judge put on her glasses, scanning the pages with small, efficient movements. "You have expert support?" she asked, and Ms. Patel nodded. "Forensic document examiner, report marked as Exhibit B, and the examiner is present and will testify." The judge turned to Douglas, counsel, and he tried on a smile that didn't fit. "Your Honor, this is a family misunderstanding being escalated into a spectacle. The mother acted in the best interests of both her children. The funds were for family needs, and any signatures in question are the result of clerical errors or memory lapses, not malice." He actually said memory lapses, as if my hand had forgotten how to be mine across 3 different years, and the judge's eyebrow climbed a millimeter, the judicial equivalent of a laugh. We called the examiner first, a woman with precise bangs and a voice that could cut glass, who explained stroke continuity, pen lifts, blunt starts and stops, natural variation versus simulated tracing. She placed blown-up exhibits on an easel, my known signatures on one side, the consents on the other, and even from the back of the room you could see the tremor in the fakes, the hesitation in the loops, the way the lowercase g tried and failed to mimic my habit of hooking left. To a reasonable degree of professional certainty, she concluded, "These signatures are not genuine." Douglas attempted a cross that sounded like a late-night infomercial. "Isn't it possible the petitioner had a cold, or was stressed, or used a different pen, and the examiner didn't blink?" Stress and ballpoint differences do not produce consistent pattern-level anomalies across 3 years, counsel. The judge wrote something down, not a lot, just enough to tell me she'd already drawn some internal conclusion. Ms. Patel moved to the money. Bank statements appeared like a parade of receipts, transfers from the trust to my mother's personal account, to a title company on the date of my sister's closing, to a dealership 2 towns over, to a private loan that matched my sister's student balance sheet line for line. "We also note," Ms. Patel said, sliding another document forward, "that the respondent took a trustee fee of $8,500 in a year where no investments were made and all assets were liquidated, which is inconsistent with the trust's purpose and the standard of care." Douglas objected, speculation, and the judge waved a hand, overruled. "The numbers will speak for themselves." Then it was my turn, not because I needed to tell a sob story. Ms. Patel had told me 3 times we were not here to litigate childhood, but because I had to testify that I didn't sign those consents, that I hadn't received distributions, that I wasn't aware of any accounting while the trust was being drained. I took the oath, my palm steady, and answered her questions with the same clean lines the examiner had used. Yes, I turned 30 on May 8th of this year. No, I did not sign any consent forms in 27, 28, or 29. No. I did not authorize a home purchase for my sister. Yes, I learned of the depletion only when I asked for disbursement at 30. Yes, I demanded an accounting and was refused. When Douglas rose for cross, he wore a look that said he believed condescension was clever. "Miss Collins," he began, "you were estranged from your family at various times, correct?" And I met his gaze without blinking. I maintained boundaries. I was never estranged from my inheritance. He smirked like he'd scored a point. "And isn't it true that you live modestly, that you have a stable job, that you don't actually need this money?" And I almost laughed because the judge's eyebrow moved again, higher this time, and Ms. Patel didn't object. She wanted this on the record. "Need is not the legal standard," I said, voice even, intent is. "My father intended this money for me, not as a slush fund for my mother's favorites." A murmur rolled through the cheap seats at the back, the place where family drama always finds an audience, and the judge tapped her pen once, not to chastise me, but to settle the room. Douglas saved my mother for last, as if the theater of her testimony might wash the ink off the forgeries. She walked to the stand with that Churchill calm she'd perfected for decades and folded her hands like a woman confessing to nothing. "I did what I thought was right for my family," she said, eyes shining at the judge and carefully not at me. "My younger daughter had needs, a baby on the way, and Sarah has always been independent. The trust was meant for family, Your Honor, and I considered both my girls." Miss Patel stood without a paper in her hands, empty palms like a promise. "Mrs. Collins," she said softly, "do you recognize these consent forms?" And my mother nodded, yes. "Did Sarah sign them?" Miss Patel asked, and my mother's smile flickered. She did. "You saw her sign them," Miss Patel pressed, and the pause was airless. She must have. I wouldn't have proceeded otherwise. The judge leaned forward a fraction. "That's not an answer. Did you witness her signature?" And my mother's throat moved. A small swallow. "I don't recall the specifics," and Miss Patel's voice cooled 10 degrees. "You don't recall Sarah visiting you on June 12th at 2 p.m. to sign this form. You don't recall her being at your home on April 9th at 11 a.m. to sign this form. You don't recall her meeting you at the bank on March 15th and..." With each date the trap closed, because our phone records and location data already said otherwise, my number pinging a cell tower 3 counties away while my mother remembered me at her kitchen table. Douglas objected, argumentative, and the judge said, "Overruled. Answer the question," and my mother's eyes hardened into the woman I knew, not the pastel ghost she'd dressed as. "I did what I had to do," she said finally, a whisper that wanted to be a shout, and Ms. Patel nodded, almost kind, "including forging your daughter's name." "Objection," Douglas snapped, and the judge didn't look up from the exhibit she was reading, sustained as to form. "The court takes note of the expert's conclusion." When the testimony ended, the judge removed her glasses and folded them on the bench with a small click that sounded like a verdict. "I'm going to be plain," she said, voice even. "This court has very little patience for trustees who cannot separate family from fiduciary duty. The documents presented today, combined with the expert report, strongly suggest impropriety. At a minimum, the respondent failed to provide an accounting and, at worst, engaged in fraud." Douglas opened his mouth, but she lifted a hand, and the room went still. "Here's what will happen," she continued. "The court grants the petition to compel an immediate, full accounting within 14 days, including all transfers, pays, and supporting invoices. The respondent is removed as trustee effective immediately. A temporary fiduciary will be appointed by this court to oversee remaining assets and to pursue recovery of improperly transferred funds. The question of forgery will be referred to the district attorney for review. Additionally, the court will entertain sanctions and surcharge after the accounting is complete." She looked at my mother for the first time like a person and not a role, and there was no softness in it. Mrs. Collins, being a mother does not grant you immunity from the law, she said. If you used your daughter's inheritance to benefit another adult child without consent, you will make restitution. If you forged signatures, you will face consequences. The gavel came down once, not loudly, just decisively, and the sound traveled through my bones like a bell that finally found its note. Rachel made a small sound, a mix of gasp and sob, the diaper bag slipping from her shoulder, a bottle rolling under a bench, and for a flicker of a second I wanted to pick it up for her, the reflex of a lifetime of being the one who stoops, the one who gathers, the one who smooths, but I stayed still, hands at my sides, spine straight, because mercy and boundaries can coexist, and I would decide when and how. Douglas was already whispering in my mother's ear, smile gone, tan dimmed by courtroom light, his eyes cutting toward me like I was the problem and not the proof. Miss Patel touched my elbow, the smallest squeeze, and I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding since the will was written. Outside the courtroom, the hallway hummed with other lives breaking and rebuilding, lawyers huddled over phones, clerks calling names, the machine of justice grinding forward on 1,000 tiny gears. My mother approached with a measured step, pearls steady, voice low enough to be private, but sharp enough to cut. "You think you've won," she said, and there it was, the truth of her, not love, not shame, not even fear, but competition. A game she believed we'd been playing since I was born. I met her eyes and felt nothing but clarity. "I think Dad finally has a referee," I said, and she flinched as if I'd turned his name into a blade, and maybe I had, or maybe I'd just given it back its weight. "You're going to ruin this family," she whispered, and I shook my head slowly. "No, Mom, you already did. I'm just stopping the bleeding." She opened her mouth, searching for the lecture she'd used my whole life, and found nothing that would hold. And in that silence, I realized the strangest thing. I didn't need her to understand. I only needed the system to do what she thought it never would. To treat me like a person whose rights mattered. Ms. Patel guided me toward the elevator, efficient as ever. "Next steps are the accounting, then we pursue recovery. Expect stall tactics, expect crocodile tears, expect a settlement offer that insults you. We will not accept it." The elevator doors slid open, and somewhere behind us I heard Rachel murmur my name. Not loud, not demanding, just a fragile thread, and I turned halfway because I am not made of stone. She stood there with the diaper bag back on her shoulder, eyes wet, lips parted, looking not like the golden child, but like a woman who had just realized the gold was pyrite. "I didn't know," she said, small and desperate, and it would have been so easy to absolve her in that moment, to gather her into the old shape of us and pretend the house she lived in hadn't been mortgaged with my future. But adulthood is choosing the right hard over the easy wrong. "Maybe," I said gently, "but you benefited, and now you'll have to face that," and I held her gaze long enough for the meaning to land, then stepped into the elevator and let the doors close on a life that had run on secrets for too long. In the lobby, sunlight knifed through high glass, dust motes floating like confetti in a parade I hadn't planned but had earned, and my phone buzzed in my bag with an email from the court, formal and dull, confirming the removal of my mother as trustee and the appointment of a temporary fiduciary. I forwarded it to Ms. Patel's office, to the examiner, to myself twice, and then I walked outside and let the September air sting my lungs. My lawyer checked her watch, already on to the next motion in her day, and gave me a last, almost smile. "You did well," she said, which in her language was a standing ovation, and then she was gone, heels tapping toward another battle that needed her teeth. I stood on the courthouse steps alone and wasn't afraid. The machine was turning, the facts were filed, the law was awake, and for once, my mother would have to answer to something bigger than her. The weeks after court felt like standing in the eye of a storm, calm on the surface, but chaos swirling all around. My mother missed the first accounting deadline, of course she did, claiming illness, then confusion, then technical issues, but the judge wasn't fooled and granted Ms. Patel's motion for sanctions. The second deadline came with a flurry of half-baked spreadsheets and handwritten notes that looked more like grocery lists than financial records. The court-appointed fiduciary tore through them like tissue, uncovering every shady transfer, every forged receipt, every lie my mother had told herself to sleep at night. By the third week, even Douglas had stopped pretending they had a case. The settlement offer arrived on a rainy Tuesday, a neatly typed document sliding across Ms. Patel's desk, full restitution of the inheritance, repayment plan for the house and car, resignation of all trustee roles, and an agreement to drop criminal referral if I accepted. Ms. Patel handed it to me without commentary, letting me read every clause, letting me taste the victory on my own tongue. When I looked up, she asked one question: "Do you want peace or do you want precedent?" I thought about it for 3 days. I walked past the lakeside property my father had tucked away for me, ran my hand along the weathered wood of the cabin porch, remembered him teaching me to skip stones and saying, "Always keep something they can't touch." I thought about Rachel, rocking her baby in a nursery painted with money that was never hers, her eyes wet when she whispered she didn't know. I thought about my mother's voice in the courtroom, brittle and sharp. I did what I had to do, as if betrayal was a duty. And finally, I thought about the little girl I had been, packing her bags to Grandma's house every time she sneezed, told she was too strong to need love, too independent to deserve more. That girl deserved more than silence. So I refused. I told Ms. Patel to let the DA have the file, to let the fraud investigation run its course, to let the precedent stand. My mother called me that night, sobbing, screaming, bargaining, her voice cracking into static as she begged me not to ruin her life. I listened for 5 minutes, every word sharp as glass, and then I said calmly, "You ruined mine when you stole Dad's promise. Now you'll answer for it," and I hung up. That was the last time we spoke. The months that followed were hard, not because I doubted the choice, but because closure is never neat. Family group chats exploded with accusations, cousins calling me heartless, uncles reminding me that blood is thicker than water. Grandma Marie, bless her, wrote me a handwritten letter that said simply, "Good for you. Your father would be proud." That was enough. The DA's office moved slower than I liked, but eventually charges were filed. Forgery. Fraud. Conversion. The words landed on my mother's shoulders like weights she could no longer shrug off. She pled down to avoid prison, but the restitution order was ironclad, the house sold, the car repossessed, my inheritance restored. I didn't spend it all. I didn't rush to buy luxury or prove my worth with shiny things. Instead, I took part of it and rebuilt the lakeside cabin, turning it into a place of peace, a sanctuary my father had always meant it to be. I started a scholarship fund in his name for kids who grew up like me, invisible but capable, overlooked but burning to prove themselves. And every time I see the name David Collins Scholarship engraved on a plaque, I know I kept his promise alive. As for Rachel, she moved into a smaller apartment, learned to live within her means, and for the first time in our lives, she stopped looking at me like a rival and started looking at me like a mirror. She reached out once, quiet, tentative, asking if we could start over for the sake of her child. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. Time will decide if she earns her place in my life again. And my mother, she lost everything she thought she controlled. The pearls, the power, the illusion. I hear she spends most of her days at church now, whispering prayers for forgiveness, prayers that will never erase the truth. She wanted me to be silent, to be small, to be grateful for scraps, and instead I stood in a courtroom and told the world she lied. That is a wound she will carry long after the money is gone. Now, when I stand on the porch of my rebuilt cabin and watch the sun melt into the lake, I feel something I never thought I would: freedom. Not just financial, but emotional, spiritual. I kept my father's promise. I reclaimed what was mine. I broke the cycle of favoritism and lies. And most of all, I learned that family isn't who shares your blood, it's who respects your worth. So tell me, If your own mother stole your inheritance and gave it to someone else, would you forgive her for the sake of family, or would you do what I did, make sure she lost everything?